Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue on with our narrative on the early civilizations, and we're going to focus in on the Bronze Age. In particular, we're going to focus in on the Bronze Age in the sort of outlying regions of Mesopotamia. We're still focusing on the Near East, and we're shifting our focus from the Nile River Valley out of our focus on Egypt and Nubia, and we're going to focus on the states that arose or that developed along the shores of the Levantine, the Levantine shores of the Eastern Mediterranean, and of course in Asia Minor. We're gonna look at these zones because they increasingly came under the influence of the great river civilizations of. They were increasingly influenced by the Nile River Valley, by Egypt and Nubia, and by Sumer and Akkad in Mesopotamia. And these zones, these areas, the peoples living there and the states that developed there, they will come to play an important role in the development of civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, the Upper Tigris and Euphrates zone, the Levantine shores, the Eastern Mediterranean, Asia Minor, and the Aegean world. These areas will come under the influence of the older literate civilizations. They all joined in on the emerging commercial relationships by land and by sea. Those terrestrial and seaborne trade routes. They all became part of a wider Bronze Age civilization. And the creation of this wider arc of civilization was created primarily due to trade routes. If we look back to past lectures, we can see how trade facilitated the rise and the expansion of the earlier civilizations, driving their sophistication to organize their growing bureaucracies. We saw this in Sumer, in Akkad, and of course in Egypt. The growth of regional trade routes brought all of these areas into increasingly regular and dependent contract. The region of the Levantine shore, the eastern coastline of the Mediterranean Sea, saw a rapid expansion in urban development because of this trade. This area was very diverse and was broken up by a number of geographical features, namely the Euphrates River and the Orontes River. In the north, the mountains of Lebanon breaks up the landscape. The Jordan River Valley breaks up the landscape. The Dead Sea sort of breaks up this landscape, and of course the Phoenician Sea and the highland areas of the Eastern Mediterranean all feature predominantly into the geographical makeup of this area, and they all influence the people living close to them. Now, the northern zone. In 2600 BC, the first literate civilization in this area was founded and it flourished at a site called Ebla. Now, the site was literate, having adopted the cuneiform script. The region also employed the same features that we would associate with Mesopotamian civilization. The entire region became dotted with walled cities based on the Mesopotamian model. The living in this area, the languages spoken in this area were related to Semitic language. They were related to the type of language spoken by the Akkadians and the Amorites. And we identify this group, these people, as Canaanites. We identify the language as Canaanite, and we identify the people as Canaanites, and it gives rise to the old geographic term, the land of Cana. Now, we estimate that there were dozens of dialects throughout the whole Levant, throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and that these dialects will go on to develop into the languages that we identify as Hebrew and Phoenician. Now, the cities of the northern Levant, of the northern Eastern Mediterranean, especially the coastal cities, would develop strong maritime traditions. They would sort of bridge, they would sort of form this bridging arc that linked the Nile marshes and Mesopotamia together. The city of Ugarit would improve upon cuneiform by devising the Ugarit syllabary, representing syllables and using considerably less characters. Now, from this, the Phoenicians would develop an alphabet in around 1100, 1000 BCE. These cities were also in contact with the nascent Aegean world, serving as a conducive for the trade and material goods and also the exchange in knowledge. These contacts and their strategic position would allow these cities to grow very wealthy and very powerful. They will begin to develop by 1550 BCE in places like Byblos and Kadesh, Hazor, Gaza, and of course Megiddo. Now, to the east of this area is an area known as Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera is simply an Arabic word for the area. But this area, this Al Jazeera area, was centered in the Khyber Valley, and it is a rich grassland. And an Al Jazeera simply means a rich fertile grassland. There's an Al Jazeera here, and there's also an Al Jazeera region in the Sudan, in the modern nation of the Sudan. And this area, this center on the Khyber Valley, was rich grassland and was served at the point of origin for a group of people known as the Hurrians. Now, the Hurrians spoke a language that is unrelated to any that we know of. We can read their language because they, like all other peoples in this region, in the Near East, they adopted cuneiform script and they used Akkadian. They and related people, the Tushpa, they will go on to lay the foundations of the later Armenian civilization. They will become the great educators of the Levant. They will pass along the technical knowledge of the other peoples to their west. They played a vital role in developing the later Hittite civilization. They even moved out to the area that was served as the core heartland of the later Assyrian kingdom. Now, the Hurrians were not a part of a greater military invasion or ethnic migration of peoples into a new area. Their migration appears to be low level and accompanied by a lot of intermarriage with Semitic and Akkadian speakers. They were able to do this effectively by mobilizing into a fighting force, which occurred right before Egypt was reorganized under Dynasty 18. Now, this mobilization was spurred by the arrival of a new Indo-Aryan people, a people known as the Mitani. Now, the Mitani were experts in chariot warfare. They employed light chariots, and they used teams of three aboard these chariots. The three team members of the chariots were the bowmen, the spearmen, and of course the charioteer, who would drive the team of two horses. These chariots came into use in Eastern Asia Minor and Armenia somewhere around 1700-1600 BCE, and it developed in these areas because they had the grasslands that were suited for horse grazing. Now, chariots were very complicated. They were complicated to construct, and they were complicated to use. To construct the chariots, you had to have expert woodworkers. You also needed the horses, and you needed the horses who were trained specifically for this type of warfare. Chariots required a warrior elite class to really operate them. You had to have people who viewed it as their purpose in life to be a charioteer, to be these type of warriors. They needed estates and a large peasantry to support them. The Mitani organized the Al Jazeera into an effective kingdom by 1550 BCE. They dominated and really served as a Mesopotamian elite. The Mitani, as far as we can tell, used names and worshiped gods of the Indus Valley. They used Sanskrit names, and they worshiped the gods of the Rig Vedas. Gods such as Mithra and Indra, Varuna, those type of deities. They were tough opponents. And for the kings of the 18th dynasty, especially Thutmose III, who spent most of his reign campaigning against them and his successors, eventually simply reached a settlement, reached an agreement with the Mitani kings, establishing the Euphrates River at the boundaries between their zones of influence. And we don't really know much else about the Mitani. Now, in Asia Minor was brought under increasing influence through trade with Mesopotamia. And we have trade goods at Troy too, an earlier version of the legendary city of Troy, from around 2600 BCE. We have evidence at a site called Alaka Ayuk. The Akkadians campaigned in this region, and the Assyrian merchants, they also began to operate in this area of Asia Minor, starting around 1900 BCE. Now, the activity, this type of activity, this type of mercantile interest served as a stimulus for a group of people known as the Hittites. And the Hittites migrated into Asia Minor somewhere around 2300 BCE. And they began to coalesce into petty kingdoms around 1700 BCE. Now, the Hittites were major players in the realm of chariot warfare. They led the way in a number of innovations. They had pastures. They were able to grow, to raise the horses, to breed horses, to maintain large horse herds, and they were really sort of native to the area. They really were attached to it. Now, the region grew grew wealthy. They established themselves as sort of the major source of horses and mules for the Levantine cities. And again, the horses and the mules were needed for warfare. The horses were needed for the chariot warfare, and the mules were needed as pack animals who are much demanded by these nascent communities that were embracing this new warfare and this new economic activity, this new drive for economic interaction. Now, the Hittite kings unified Asia Minor, bringing all the petty kingdoms in line and establishing the Hittite Old Kingdom that was centered on the city of Atusas, which is near modern-day Bogazkel. The first two great kings, Hattusilus I and Mercilus I, unified the Hittites and carried out the early Hittite campaigns into the northern Levant. Their objective was simply to capture the wealthy Mesopotamian-style cities of the Levant. They didn't really They didn't really have much else, or really weren't interested in much else beyond capturing these wealthy cities. They were fortunate during this endeavor because the Egyptians were not composed enough to intervene. The Babylonian kingdom was on the wane and was no longer really capable of opposing any major power. Now, the Hittites realigned their gods to fit in more with the Hurrian pantheon. They adopted literacy. They gravitated towards the prestige goods, the legal traditions of the older Mesopotamian kingdoms, the literature of the older Mesopotamian kingdoms, the myth, and especially the creation myth and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And again, they followed the precedent of their predecessors by adopting first the Akkadian language, and then creating a version of the Hittite language in cuneiform. They translated, they evolved the Hittite language into this written form, but they kept Akkadian. Akkadian was still the preferred popular language of the Near East, and they kept Akkadian in that form. They did not change it. They did not substitute or attempt to substitute Akkadian, Hittite for Akkadian. What we see is the extension of Mesopotamian customs and practices into a distant land where the geography was very different. Mesopotamia, as we have discussed in numerous lectures, is a floodplain, and Mesopotamia is a very upland, hilly, rocky area. A lot of it is, particularly the area where the Hittites formed their kingdom, was was a radically different setting. It was a radically different geographical scene there. And for most of most of the Hittite kingdom was just a land of steppes and rugged terrain. It is a testimony to the Hittite kings that they were able to take the diverse peoples of Asia Minor and organize them into a competent composite state. Mercilus I was the king who organized the first great projection of Hittite strength. It was Mercilus I who led the campaign into Babylon that sacked the city. And this event shocked Mesopotamia and was widely recorded. Now, Babylon was the great trade center of the Near East. It was the cultural hub, and the great center of learning in the Near East. Babylon was not just the most important city in Mesopotamia, it was the number one city of the ancient Near East. The sack of Babylon highlights how unsuccessful the heirs of Hammurabi had been in maintaining imperial authority and in maintaining imperial defenses. The Hittites were able to travel 300 miles down the Euphrates and appear before a surprised Babylon. The attack did not serve Merciless I well, or the Hittites well. Shortly after his return, Merciless I was greeted by a group of Hittite noblemen who were angry over his long absence, and he was murdered shortly thereafter his return. And his death plunged the Hittite kingship into a succession crisis for the next few decades. Now, the attack on Babylon allowed the Kassites and Iranian people to move in and displace the heirs of Hammurabi. Now, this was the scene that greeted the Egyptians as they moved into the Levant. The Kassites were in Babylon, ruling in Mesopotamia, and the Mitani were in the Jazeera, ruling over the northern Levantine cities, and the Hittites were in Asia Minor, trying to reorganize their fractured kingdom. Now, the Hittites would reorganize their kingdom, and they would emerge once again on the scene under the rule of several notable kings. First of whom was Suppiliamus I. He ruled at the same time that Akhenaten was ruling, and of course, as we discussed during Akhenaten's reign, he forsaked the Levantine Empire of the Egyptians to focus on its monotheism, to focus on the religious reforms within Egypt proper. The Hittites were able to overrun the northern Egyptian provinces in the Levant, and after the deaths of Suppiliamus I, he was succeeded by two of his sons, Merciless II and Muwatallis. And both of those sons, both of those kings, campaigned successfully to gain more of the wealthy cities of the Near East and to harness the resources and the institutions of those cities that allowed the Hittite kings, to build a very powerful state in Asia Minor. They did this by building an effective coalition with the bellicose border peoples that they had surrounding the core of their kingdom in Asia Minor. Now, the Hittites were really innovative in devising methods of prolonging their influence. They used military colonies, alliance systems, they built a road system, they instituted vassal treaties on subjugated peoples. They were very marked hardliners when it came to tribute being paid in chariots or in manpower, and they were very strict hardliners in making sure that these payments, these tribute gifts, were paid punctually. Their capital was in a way a ceremonial center where the Hittite kings sought to impress their vassals with the splendors of Hatti. Hatti was their kingdom. Hatti is the name of the Hittite kingdom. Hattusis is the city, and Hatti is the kingdom. Now, this course of action put the Hittites on a collision course with the Egyptian kings, who under Ramses II of the 19th dynasty campaigned in the Levant to recapture those lost Egyptian provinces. Ramses and Muwatallis, sorry about that, got a tied tongue for a minute. Ramses II and Muwatallis, they fought each other. They fought each other to a draw at the Battle of Kadesh. And Ramses went on to celebrate the battle, had a great victory, a victory of the First Order back in Egypt. But Ramses had to sign a treaty with the Hittites. He signed a treaty with King Hattusis III, and in this treaty, he acknowledged the loss of those northern Levantine provinces, the Egyptian loss of those northern provinces, and this would be the first in a series of international checks on Egyptian power by Near Eastern rivals. From this point on, Egypt would slowly go into decline and would soon thereafter simply withdraw altogether from the Levant, from the eastern shores of the Levant. And it is at this point that we'll break and we'll continue on with our look. At the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. And as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture.